So today we are going to get into a little bit more of an in-depth understanding about consciousness and the spinal structures and what happens whenever our nervous system gets distorted in specific ways, and how the nervous system and the spine relates to our ability to express all the different levels of consciousness. So before we get into that, Rachel has a question. So I'm going to go ahead and allow Rachel to talk. And Rachel, you will unmute yourself. And what's up? What's your questions?
So I had a chance to do the movements in the afternoon without the children distracting, and I noticed the energy moving, not all of the energy that's trapped in my sacrum, but a lot of it into the lower solar plexus, upper abdominal area. And then I just wondered if I kept doing that same sequence of movements, if over time that moves the energy where it needs to be, or if I should be more intentional with switching up the movement.
Well, you could do it either way. And what you want to do is you want to go with what works. So you are able to move that energy with those sequence of movements. So by continuing with those sequence of movements, just see if the energy and the sensation continues to move into other areas. And if it does, by all means, just keep going. But if you notice that by doing those sequence of movements, it moves it from one area to another area on a consistent basis, then something else might need to be added in, or something else like just a few of those movements practice, not necessarily all of them, in order to get that energy to move out, or move through, to be able to flow through the solar plexus.
So is the goal that it flows through the solar plexus, then up through the crown chakra?
The goal is to have a flow. Okay. And in our body, we have flows that are upwards. We have flows that are downwards. We have flows that are front to back. We have spiral flows. We have all sorts of flows. The only time that we are aware of those flows, unless we are in a non-ordinary state of consciousness. In our normal, everyday, ordinary state of consciousness, we don't notice those flows unless something's wrong. Unless one of those flows is blocked up or flowing backwards or in a direction that is not ideal for us. So in our normal, ordinary state of consciousness, we really should not be aware of those flows if everything is flowing perfectly. So from a normal, ordinary state of consciousness, the goal is just to get everything moving and allow the body, allow the systems that we're normally not conscious of to handle the flow of that movement. Now, once you get up into more of the non-ordinary states of consciousness, that's where the potential to be aware of normal flow comes in. And once you're aware of normal flow, then you can start being more conscious about what you're doing in order to impact those flows. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and then I also had a question in my 20-minute research of Taoist subtle body philosophy. What this is menstruation retention something that's useful?
It depends on what your goal is. I would say for the average person, seminal and menstrual retention would not necessarily be a beneficial thing. If you are, like I said, utilizing and moving towards these non-ordinary states of being, then absolutely it could be incredibly beneficial. But it needs to be balanced out. And this is where a lot of times, like I said, if you're in that normal ordinary consciousness, it's hard to achieve balance with these types of things. So like I said, I can't necessarily say, is that beneficial or is it detrimental? Because it depends on the person and it depends on the situation and the scenario. And this is, that is a practice Well, of course, not the menstrual retention, but that is a practice that I do have a lot of experience with, and I've experienced a lot of benefits. And I've also found ways in which I wasn't balancing it out, and it did create some problems. So I would say for the average person, that's really, really advanced. And so just be aware that when you're doing something like that, that is an incredibly, incredibly powerful practice. And if the flows, the normal flows are not there, if they are inhibited, then a practice like that can actually enhance that dysfunction. It can actually add to that dysfunction. And that may not be a bad thing, because a lot of times whenever the water is dammed back in a certain area, if you increase the pressure, that will eventually blast through the dam. But you have to be super aware that I'm going to do this practice. This practice is going to mess me up more so that that flow can finally be expressed properly. So like I said, for the average person who's just looking to feel better and function better, that would be a really advanced practice. But if you're really willing to embrace some of the pain and discomfort that's necessary in order to break through to these higher levels, then I can tell you through personal experience, it's an amazing practice. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
Uh-huh. Okay, so in general, the spine itself, the reason that we as chiropractors focus so much on the spine is because the spine, the bony structure of the spine, they are directly, intimately connected with the cells of the nervous system. Now, the nervous system is how we experience the world. Every thought that we have, every feeling that we have, every idea, every belief, every sense, every sight, every memory, all of the ways that we actually have an experience, regardless of where that experience is thought or perceived to come from, it actually comes from the nervous system. So the way that the cells of the nervous system, the way they are affected, affects the way that they process the information that we take in and create our own experiences. So one of the gifts that the spine offers us is the gift of experience. And the shape and the position and the tension and the tone of our spine directly affects the shape and the position and the tension and the tone of our experience. So, for example, when we are in a survival based experience, okay, if a tiger is chasing us, one of the things that will happen is we will actually go more into a flexed or more into a C type of curve in order to stretch the spinal cord a little bit. And when the spinal cord is stretched, information flows much, much faster. And we experience that as a lot more vivid and a lot more intense. So when we're being chased by a tiger, our body goes into this intensifying because we want to intensify all of the information coming in so that we are able to really see and react very quickly to, is there an avenue? Is there a way out of this scenario or this situation? From a physical survival point, if we do not see that tiger running at us as a very intense experience, we are less likely to jump into action really, really quickly. Okay, so the more tension that we have on our spine and on our nervous system, the more intensely we experience life. Okay, when the nervous system is much more in an extension, in an opened type of space, what that does is that decreases the tension on the spine. Decreasing the tension on the spine slows the information processing down. So we're able to really be in the present moment in a much easier and much more nuanced way. All of the information is coming in slower. So each bit of information is going to be able to have kind of more of its own time and space to be processed. Whereas in a survival-based situation, it's not about processing everything. It's only about processing the information that we absolutely need to be survived. Okay. So when we talk about some of the gifts of the spine, the experience, okay, the emotions, the way that we have those experiences is another gift that the spine gives us. Okay. The spine is a very, very stable and hard. So those bones are the heart, some of the hardest structures of the body. So another gift the spine gives us is going to be stability. Okay, the ligaments and the tendons and the disc, all of the connective tissue around the spine, the muscles have the ability to elongate and to contract, to cause nearly instantaneous movements. Okay, but the connective tissue around the spine, it has the ability to slowly become more and more dense to hold us in a particular position or a particular tone, or it has the ability to become more fluid-like, to become less dense, which allows more ease for the muscles to engage. So the spine not only gives us stability, which is whenever that connective tissue forms that very dense structure, it holds us into a particular way of experiencing. It holds us into a particular way of taking information and processing that information. And this is a very good thing, because if something is very, very consistent in our life, if every single Thursday we get into an argument, okay, then every single Thursday, what our body wants to do is our body wants to prepare for that ahead of time. And if our body knows that every single Thursday we're going to get into a fight, then every single Wednesday, we want our connective tissue to be holding us into a position to be able to be ready for that. Rather than the muscles that require a lot of energy because they constantly need energy to contract, the connective tissue, if it just becomes denser, it can hold us into those positions without a lot of energy expenditure. Okay. On the opposite end of the spectrum, the other gift that the spine gives us is flexibility, the ability to change whenever those connective tissue structures are more loose, whenever they're more fluid. It allows the nervous system to be a lot more dynamic, and we can process one situation this way and we can experience it totally different the next time if that's beneficial, if there's enough change in the environment and it's beneficial for us to experience that nuanced change so that we can grow and that we can learn and that we can constantly change. So there's a time for flexibility and change, but there's also a time for stability if change is not happening in a consistent manner, if it's consistently stable. So the gifts and the benefits that the spine gives us are going to be experience. Okay, the change or the emotions or the feelings of those experiences, it's going to give us stability, and it's going to give us flexibility and instability. Okay, so whenever we're working with the spine as a chiropractor, one of the things that if for any chiropractor that is very experienced, or those chiropractors that were smart enough to learn from someone who's very experienced, after a while you start to recognize that certain ways of going about life, certain belief systems, certain mindsets, certain experiences, certain habits will show up in the way that the body holds itself, or in the way that the body has trouble holding itself. So some of the things that happens whenever I am putting my hands on somebody's spine is I can a lot of times generally tell whenever we've had a traumatic experience, or whether that traumatic experience is still being played out. Where is the body struggling to either achieve flexibility, or where the body has too much flexibility and really needs stability? Are things changing too much in the body? And that again has a lot to do with our experiences and the way that we experience life. So there's certain patterns that are very generalized. Now, where we have these patterns can come about because of different experiences, and they can have different results. But these general patterns are going to keep us in a certain perspective, or are going to limit us from a certain perspective in some part of our life. Okay, so we can have this perspective that there's not enough time. We can have that perspective in our work life, but we may not have it in our family life. In our family life, it's like, well, there's abundance of time, so I don't really got to put in that much energy or effort into spending time with my kids, because they're always going to be there. But my work, oh my gosh, if I don't accomplish this so much in my work, there's not enough time, so I got to spend all my time working. So again, the way that we experience these distortion patterns can be different, but this pattern of not enough time or not needing to worry about that time, that can come up because of a certain way that the nervous system is distorted and how that affects the information processing. So today, we're going to talk about some of the basic distortion patterns and how this affects our perception and our response and our experience to life, how it affects the ability of our consciousness to be expressed through this physical structure. Okay, so in the practice that I do, network spinal, there's 5 basic distortion patterns, and again, how these show up and exactly where they show up affects the consciousness in a detailed and nuanced way. But the general 5 patterns have some consistency over it. So the first pattern is what we call phase 1, and in phase 1, what we're really looking at, the distortion or the excessive or lack thereof of tension between how the skull sits on the very, very bottom of the pelvis, or the sacrum. So whenever the back of the skull or the sacrum itself, which is the sacrum is that bone that sits right between the 2 hip bones and is the big bone at the very bottom of the spine. So the sacrum is like that pivot point between the part of our body that moves based on where the ground is and the upper part of our body that moves based on where open space is. Okay, so if there's a distortion, either too much tension or not enough tension to either forward or backwards or side to side in the skull's relationship to the sacrum, what that's going to push us into is an inability to really be in the moment. Okay, so whenever that happens, there's going to be a draw to be excessively focused on the future or excessively stuck in the past. And again, it depends on where that distortion pattern is, whether there's too much tension, oh my God, what's going to happen, or there's not enough tension, which is nothing needs to happen, wasn't it great, or man, I can't believe that this happened in the past, and there's not enough tension to really move us into the future. So when we work on this phase 1, this occiput and sacrum pattern, the gift, the benefit that brings is it brings the person into the here and the now. Now, being in the here and the now is not always an ideal thing. It's not always a comfortable thing, because a lot of times the reason that we jump into the future, or the reason that we are stuck in the past, is because those 2 things being thoughts, and that's really all they are, is they're concepts that we have. Being in the concept of that is way better than actually being in the experience of the pain that's going on in the moment. So this can be very much of a distortion pattern that comes about because we don't have enough energy. We don't have enough resourcefulness to really be with what's going on here and now. And so we'll try to escape into the thoughts, into the concepts, rather than really being in the here and now. And that's good because that can make us more comfortable. And if we're not so overwhelmed with the pain, if there is a little bit more comfort, the potential for us to be able to generate more energy is there, to some extent. So just because we do that, jumping into the future, jumping into the past, doesn't necessarily mean that that's a bad thing. But if we get stuck into that and we can't undistort, we can't come back to the present moment, that's where this really becomes a problem. So the linear conditioning, the way that we remember things, the way that we are projecting the past into the future, that's a direct result of this distortion pattern that will come up. So the gift that comes through when we're able to liberate that stuckness, that all of the energy that's bound up in that pattern, is being in the present moment becomes a lot more effortless, and it becomes a lot more practical, and it becomes something that we could really do. Okay. So the second way that our body can distort, okay, is it can either throw out the neck at the very top or more towards the bottom. Okay. So if the body throws out the neck at the very, very top, the first vertebrae, what this is going to push us into is this experience that we are somehow betrayed by time or resources like money. There's just not enough. There's not enough time. There's not enough money. And therefore, I have to do all of these other different things because our experience, the way that we're taking in information, tells us that there is a lack. So it puts us into this kind of hyper focused, way too much into, really trying to guard and pull and hold things in for ourselves because there is not enough, especially time and money. So we're going to be stuck in the day to day, into the details, into, too much of exactly the way that things need to be done. We're going to be kind of a little bit anal retentive because if we're not going to be able to get enough because there's not enough out there, right? So the gift that comes through when we're able to clear this distortion pattern in this upper portion of the neck, in this first vertebrae, is that we're going to be able to kind of let go and trust in the flow of time and in the flow of space. Okay. There is enough. It's not necessarily showing up right now, but I know that because I can trust time, because I can trust the abundance of an infinite universe, that now I can just kind of be. All right. So the other distortion pattern that can come up be in this basic distortion pattern in the neck is going to be the lower portion of the neck. Whenever the lower portion of the neck really distorts around the fifth and sixth vertebrae, this is going to be betrayed, and the betrayal is going to be somehow tied to the experience of anger or rage. And it can be our anger or rage. It can be our suppression of anger or rage. It can be a wound that we receive because of someone else's anger or rage, or a wound that we receive because someone that was in a protective guardian role of us was not able to express anger or rage. And because they weren't able to express anger, which is the fuel, it is the information that we need to confront injustice. If a warrior cannot experience anger and rage on the battlefield, okay, then that warrior is not going to be able to use all of the chemical resources in order to win the battle. And if they don't win the battle, then their family is going to be victimized. They are going to be victimized. So the appropriate use of anger is to confront and prevent injustice so that victimization does not occur. Okay, so we can have a wound because someone misuses anger in too much of a way, but we can also experience a wound because someone does not use anger, and then we get victimized, or we witness them get victimized, and they're a part of us. So whenever they get victimized, we start to experience that. So too much or too little of anything creates an imbalance, which can create a problem. So phase two, the middle lower portion of the neck, has a lot to do with the inability to use anger, either by ourselves or by somebody else. So someone who is in this pattern is going to be expressing excessive, inappropriate anger, or not enough anger, and then the lackadaisical, the hopelessness, the apathy, and the depression that comes along with victimization and injustice. Okay. So this one also has to do a little bit with the fear that there's not enough time. But the gift that comes, or excuse me, this one is, we're not able to really connect with our inner child. And children especially, they have no problem expressing any of the ranges of emotion. And because they don't have a problem expressing them, they will flow through those emotions really quickly. Because adults, because we either have too much or too little of something, that's whenever we'll get stuck. And, that will just become kind of a pattern or more of a habit. So whenever we are connecting with the phase 5, with the phase 2 lower portion of the neck, one of the things that we want to do is we want to give ourselves permission to not only be that innocent child that needs protection, it needs the support of the anger and the protectiveness of the anger of those in the community, but it also needs the ability to express the anger also. So being able to be and really embrace that innocent, helpless child in all of us, but also being able to embrace and express the inner bitch or the inner asshole, okay? Because that's necessary sometimes also. So finding that balance between the two, not being stuck in either one of those archetypes, okay? That's the gift that comes along when we're able to liberate the energy that gets stored up in this portion of the body and in this distortion. Is that we start to trust that relationships will work out. And they can be a relationship between ourselves. They can be a relationship between ourselves and others. They can be a relationship between ourselves and some inanimate thing, like our relationship between us and finances, the relationship that we have with our environment, the relationship that we have with our home, the relationship that we have with society. Okay, so the gift, when we're able to own the ability to appropriately express anger, is the gift of being able to set boundaries, hold boundaries, and therefore relationships can work out. Okay, so the next phase is going to be much more of the pelvis. Okay, and it's going to be either the entire pelvis swinging off to one side, or it's going to be that sacrum itself just swinging off to one side. Okay, and what happens within this distortion pattern is there's a distorted sense of identity. There's a distorted sense of self. Now, I call this the should phase. Should I do this? It should be this way. I shouldn't be doing this. That should be this way. Okay. So whenever we're stuck in that should stage, we don't have a strong foundation up underneath us. And we're always going to be shifting from one should to another should, because once you go down the should hole, once you go down the should chute, that's a never ending process, because should is all imagination. Should is completely divorced from reality. Reality is what is. Should is a pure imagination. And you can use your imagination. Inventors use their imagination to say, this doesn't exist yet, but I think it should exist. And if they have a strong connection, if they're able to use their conscious expression machine like their body appropriately, they'll be able to bring that should into reality. But whenever there's a disconnect there and we only get into the should, we can become inhibited as far as bringing that into reality. And then we just stay in this imagination of it should or it shouldn't be, and we just spin our wheels, running around. So this is one of the things that I've noticed. This is not necessarily something that's actually taught, but there's a pattern that I've seen, is it whenever the pelvis swings off to the right side, or whenever we have a lot of pain or discomfort on the right side of the hip or the pelvis, a lot of times that relates to some sort of imbalance in our relationship with the identity of the outside world. It should be this way. I think that they should not be doing this. I can't believe this is happening because this should be what's happening. Okay. Whenever we experience that same thing on the left side, when we experience an instability or a pain or a distortion off to the left side, that more is related to our relationship to the internal environment. I should be this way. I should feel this way. I shouldn't be this way. This is the person that I should be. This is the person that I shouldn't be. So that this is not a hard and fast rule, because there are people that fall opposite this pattern for for the way that their brain is set up. But in general, this is kind of a more of a generality, that more times whenever that right side is out, it's the shoulds for the outside world that are really messing us up and divorcing us from reality and preventing us from bringing in our ideals into form, into this reality. And the left side has more to do with our sense of self-identity internally and our shoulds. So the benefit that we get whenever we are able to clear out and liberate this energy that gets stuck into holding ourselves into these positions is we get this solid foundation of I am who and what I am, and that's great, and that's acceptable, and that's perfect for where I am. And the outside world is perfect and acceptable and exactly where it should be, so that we have this strong foundation to say, no matter what is, I am good with what is because I am. All right? So the next phase, or the next distortion that can come up, is going to be the more of the upper middle portion of the neck. So the second, third, and fourth vertebrae in the neck. Whenever this starts to come up, what this ends up doing is this locks us into a one-sided brain focus. Okay, so a lot of times what we'll end up doing is, if it locks us into more of the kind of left brain focus, we will be obsessive about thinking things through and understanding things through, rather than being able to be aware and open and receptive to our feeling senses. So we will think in exchange or at the expense of our feelings. Okay. And ideally, we want to have both, because each side of the brain processes information differently. Just because it processes information differently does not mean that logic is inherently better than intuition and feeling, because you can get to the exact same place using logic, if you use it correctly, as you can a feeling sense. And you can get to the same place from a feeling sense if you are able to use logic. But ideally, we want to use both. We want to use both sides of our brain and process information, what's called bilaterally, rather than just using one half. So if we're only using one half, we will be logical at the expense of our feelings, our emotions, and our intuition. And it can also go the opposite way, where we can be excessively focused on our feelings and our sensations at the expense of our logic. Okay, so whenever we're in a phase 4, when we're in an upper middle neck distortion, this is going to push us towards what's called unilateral, where we either divorce ourselves from logic or we divorce ourselves from feeling and emotion. And either one, both of those distortion patterns are equally destructive. And I know some of us, probably because we're on the side of being excessively focused on logic, we will be like, wow, everybody needs to be more logical. If the world was a lot more logical, well, then there would be really a lot less problems. And that's not totally true, because there are an equal amount of problems that come about because of an excessive use of logic and reasoning without the opposite half of that. There's just as many problems that are caused by too much logic and reason as there are for too much feeling and emotion. Okay, they both need to be balanced out. Okay, so the benefit that we get is that we're able to feel what is right, as well as think our way through what is right. And if we can feel what is right and think our way through, this gives us an ability to move in a direction of really being able to embrace that what is right for us as an individual is not always right for everyone else. If we're only using logic, we will use this blanket statement, which is what is right for me is automatically right for everyone else. But keep in mind, this is literally the brain function of the sociopath. of the psychopath, of the religious extremist, of the terrorist, which is I know what is right for everyone, and it's completely divorced from the feeling sense, the compassion, the love. This is right for me, but everybody else has the right to do what's right for them. But again, if we're too much in this thinking without the feeling, that's literally the brain function of the sociopath and the psychopath, which whenever they put them in functional MRI units, the sociopath, the psychopathic neurological function is very, very similar, if not identical, to the religious extremist and the terrorist brain function. So again, neither one's good, neither one's bad. We want to be able to have both, okay? And the last distortion pattern that can come up is going to be some sort of distortion which involves both the upper neck and the pelvis, or the lower neck and the very, very bottom of the sacrum. So the first distortion pattern that we can have in phase 5 is going to be the upper neck, the second vertebrae, and how the pelvis holds itself. Okay, this distortion pattern, phase 5, is the pattern of it's impossible, so why even try? Okay, when our second vertebrae, the upper portion of our neck, and our pelvis is distorted and out, that's going to push us into this experience of it's impossible because of some circumstance, because of some external force, because of some sort of memory, some sort of thing that is out here controlling us. So why would I even try if I am being set up to fail? Okay, the lower pattern, the pattern of the lower neck with the tailbone, this one's very, very much related to fear, shame, and guilt. And this one will come about as it's impossible because I am bad, because I am not enough, because something about me is broken, and therefore why would I even try? Because no matter what I do, I'm not going to be enough to really fulfill this. Okay, so and keep in mind that we can also have a combination of these different distortion patterns. Okay, so whenever we're paying attention to the outside world, this is a lot of what we do as chiropractors to kind of train ourselves, is to look at the way that people are holding themselves when they're talking. Okay, you'll notice that somebody that's very, very defeated, they will have this kind of flexed forward posture, and that's going to kind of push that lower portion of the neck. And you'll notice that their back is kind of rounded and their pelvis may be tucked up underneath. And they're really defeated about themselves, if they have this low self-esteem pattern, you'll notice, because the lower portion of the neck and the very, very bottom of the sacrum or the tailbone, they're both kind of like in this tucked forward. Oh, there's really no point in me continuing on because blah, 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 blah. Okay. If you notice somebody that's really defeated and they're like, there's no way that I'm going to be able to do this. It's just, that's just not possible. That's not how society works. You'll notice that there's going to be kind of this distortion between the upper portion of the neck, how they hold their neck and the shoulders, and how they hold their pelvis. Those are kind of going to be kind of in opposition to each other. Okay. When someone that's really not sure, whenever they're stuck in, I'm not confident about myself, I'm not confident in the outside world, whenever they're talking, you'll notice them shifting their weight back and forth from one leg to the other. And that's literally them going back and forth between the shoulds. If you're not confident about yourself, you're not confident in the way that the outside world is and that you can handle that, that's whenever all those shoulds are going to come in, that phase 3 pattern. So you'll notice somebody that's constantly shifting their legs back and forth from one leg to the other. They're going back and forth between it should be, I should be, it shouldn't be, I shouldn't be. Okay. And there's going to be this kind of conflict with the way that world really is. Okay. So just kind of pay attention to this. It's really fascinating to watch the way that people are expressing themselves and the way that they're perceiving this information, they're perceiving the outside world. Everybody perceives things differently. And one of the reasons why we perceive things differently is because of the structure and the shape and the tension and the tone of that information processing, that processor that we have that's within the bony structures of the spine and the skull. So, hopefully this was interesting. Hopefully this wasn't too heady. This is a lot of information that I study to be able to help everybody else out. Not everybody likes, all of this detailed information. A lot of people are like, shut up, Tad, just make it work. So in doing this, is there anybody that has any questions, that has any comments about this concept of the way that you experience life is directly related to your state of being? Or like Donnie Epstein says, we see the world not as it is, we see the world as we are. Does anybody have any questions or comments or curiosities or C5 anger management issues about this concept?
I have a question.
Yes.
Aside from like SRI and network care, what are like some other things that we can do to like shift these phase patterns? Like I would imagine maybe yoga.
Yoga can be really good. Yoga is going to take a little bit more time because these patterns also alter the way that we can move ourselves. So yoga is one way, but that's kind of it takes a while to really be able to drop deep enough into the right posture to get the stretch or the compression at the right area for long enough to change the connective tissue in a consistent enough way where we'll be able to perceive information in a different way.
That makes sense.
So yoga is one way, but then again, you could say that with any form of exercise. If you move your body right, the right way, the right amount of times, it's going to make a change. So any form of movement-based experience, dance could literally do the same thing. Now, because dance involves more than just moving the body, because it involves the emotions, because it involves a lot more feeling sense, I would suspect, and I haven't seen any studies on this, there's some evidence that's kind of that points to this, but I would suspect you could probably clear a pattern faster through dance than you could yoga. And I would say this for the average person, if you're a yoga instructor and you are just, everything about each one of the different postures and how it affects the experience and all, I am sure you could clear these patterns really quickly with yoga. I'm talking about more kind of the average person. But another way to do this would be the number one, just being aware, just accepting and acknowledging, wow, I'm seeing the world through this lens. Okay, I am seeing the world as if it's really intense and really harsh. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, just by making that observation, just by having that thought, you're already starting to change the way that the brain is organizing and holding the body into that position. So number one, the first step, no matter how you proceed after that, the first step and the most important step is to recognize that you are stuck in a pattern. Just that recognition can start to change it. Okay. Let's see, another way that you could change this pattern. And again, this would also depend on your triad of change. Things like EMDR therapy, things that involve, going out and like nature therapy, where you're having these experiences that are totally different from your normal experiences. There are a lot of times that using, certain plant medicines in a very, very intentional and a very honoring way and a very guided way can be very, very beneficial for bringing in non-ordinary states of consciousness that can make us more aware of things that are outside of that pattern. But again, what that does is that just brings us more awareness of the pattern itself, and it's that awareness that shifts it. So there's counseling, psychoanalysis, a lot of different things can be very beneficial in not only making us aware of the pattern, but also bringing in information outside of that pattern, which ultimately goes into disrupting that pattern. And that's the secret. That is the magic behind the adjustments. And that's behind a really good structural adjustment or the lighter touch adjustments that we do at Organic Living Chiropractic. Is what we're doing is we're identifying where in the body can we put in a force, whether that's a big force to move the bone or that's a small force to stimulate the sensors up underneath the skin. Where is the place that I can put the least amount of force that's going to bring brand new information into the system that's far outside of that pattern? And whenever that new information comes in, it gives the brain the ability to contrast that pattern. If the brain can only see this and it can't see this, it's not going to be able to see the space between nor the space on the outside. So giving the body, giving the brain some sort of contrasting information to that stuck information processing pattern is the key to disrupting that pattern. And there's lots of ways that information can come in. It could be come in through massage. It can come in through counseling. It can come in through movements. It can come in through chemicals. It can come in a lot of different ways. But the goal is to disrupt that pattern by bringing in some totally different information.
Like smacking your head against a mountain.
Absolutely. Going through the rehab process and coming through stronger.
Okay, I have a geeky question, and I probably already know the answer to it, but when you're stuck in one of those patterns, if you've been there for a long time, does that create like actual lesions in the brain?
It does. It does. It inhibits certain parts of the brain from being able to function, and those parts of the brain can literally wither and die. It can also cause an excessive function. It can cause certain nerve cells to have to overwork themselves, and then they can be overworked to death, and then they can die off. So a lesion can be caused by either not enough stimulus or too much stimulus.
That makes sense. And then in theory, neurogenesis and creating new neurons will like help all that?
It could be new neurons. It also could be synaptogenesis, which is creating new connections. So your brain can literally wire around that damage. There's a really, really interesting case, and it was a guy that was out of Britain. And what they ended up finding, and this guy he was in his doctor in either he was doing his master's thesis or his doctoral thesis. He was doing some sort of like really high education level, and one of the teachers noticed that his head was larger than the normal head to body ratio. And this teacher was into neurology, and they had a functional MRI machine, so they were just kind of like, hey, let's throw this guy into the MRI machine and let's just see what's going on neurologically. And what they found out is that he had the very, very bottom portion of the brain, so the brain stem, and then he had a 1 centimeter layer of brain tissue around the very, very outside, and everything else inside the brain was fluid. So he had less than 10% of a brain, and nobody throughout his life knew. He had a family, he had a job, he was in, like I said, high level, education learning. And he was doing all of this with 10% of a brain. So 10% of that structure. So the actual nerve cell may not be as important as how many connections that nerve cell has to its neighboring cell. So how many connections, the relationship between nerve cells may be, we don't know this for sure, but may be more important than the actual amount of brain cells.
That's crazy.
Isn't it?
Yeah. So then did that guy have any other like health issues? Like if he
Nope.
like with the brain being structurally
Nope.
not normal?
Nope. If they would not have done that image, nobody would have ever known. There was no symptoms
Wow.
other than his head was a little bit larger, and he had a condition at a very early childhood called hydrocephalus,
Oh
where
yeah.
there's a lot more cerebrospinal fluid. So this kind of goes back, and it really pokes a hole in this concept that we have, that our thinking and our consciousness is a result of brain function, rather than our thinking and consciousness having a relationship with brain function. Correlation versus causation. But that's maybe a topic for another class. Anybody else have any questions? Oh, okay, Barbara, I can't unmute you, so go for it. Unmute yourself.
Yeah, can you hear me? Okay.
Yep.
So what about, for example, temperature? I've noticed like sometimes if I'm doing something and I know there's a change, I may feel cold, sometimes warm, but especially the cold is like when I'm just still, but something is changing. Is that also?
So your experience of temperature is related to a lot of different things. So for like one instance, whenever somebody has been really tight and bound up in a defensive posture for a really long time, their muscles, because they're working so hard, they generate a lot of heat. And when that person relaxes, okay, the muscles are not generating as much heat. Now, the core body temperature doesn't change. The air temperature around them doesn't change. But because the relationship to where that heat is changes, the person, by contrast, can actually start to feel a little bit cold. Okay, you can have a change in your body temperature. If your body core temperature goes up, like if you have a fever, you will experience the air around you as a little bit colder. That's why whenever your body temperature goes up, a lot of times you feel cold and shake. The exact opposite is true. If your core temperature is lower, then you will experience the air temperature around you as warmer, and you will feel the inclination to be hot. This is my core temperature is typically about a degree and a half under normal temperature, and I feel hot way more often than I feel cold. There can be hormones that are involved in this. Whenever the body will be flooded, like in certain circumstances, whenever menopause is not going really smoothly, and there's a drastic fluctuation fairly quickly in estrogen and progesterone and testosterone, that can change the body's perception of heat and temperature. So there can be a change in the flow of like cerebrospinal fluid or the flow of lymph in your body, and that can affect how you're experiencing change. So if you notice like a flow of warmth, that can be the connective tissue reorienting and the lymph tissue reorienting. If you feel a flow of coolness, like a stream flowing this direction, that can be the exact opposite. That can be things kind of becoming more dense. So there's a lot of different things that can add to our experience of temperature. But ultimately, Barbara, that experience of temperature is all created in your head, not necessarily in your body, nor in the environment around
you. Okay, thank you.
Anybody else? Let's see, are there any questions that we have on Facebook? Nobody seems to have any questions. So since nobody has any more questions, I want to thank everybody for showing up. I want to thank everybody that's here in person on the Zoom call. I want to thank everybody that's tuned into Facebook. And I want to thank everybody that may be listening to this at a different time and space because you're watching a recording. So everybody have an amazing day. Please, please, please share all this information, share these posts, go to our YouTube page, sign up for, to what is it? Follow our YouTube page. Yes. Subscribe to our YouTube page, send out the links. Let's get as much of this information out as we can, because the more conscious, aware people we have walking around, the more people that recognize they are not victims to scenarios and circumstances, the more empowered, aware, conscious people we are, the better of a society and a world we're going to have. So thank you, everybody, for showing up, and we will see everybody tomorrow, if not sooner. I love you all.
Bye.